Good morning and welcome to our 11th annual Battle of San Jacinto Symposium. My name is Jeff Dunn. I'm Vice President of the Friends of San Jacinto Battleground, and on behalf of our organization, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you for coming out today and participating in this event. This year is a red letter year. It's the 175th anniversary of the Texas Revolution, the Battle of San Jacinto. And as a result of that, I would like to wish everybody a happy septennial, can't pronounce it.
No.
Which is one of the official names of the event, but the shorter version would be the 175th anniversary.
You could put a dinosaur.
This event would not be possible without the hard efforts of our San Jacinto Symposium Committee. This is an all-volunteer committee. We have no paid staff. I'd like to express appreciation to David Britton and David Singleton, our co-chairs, as well as Trivia Beverly, Jim Davis, Barbara Eves, Cliff Gillick, Joe and Eva Golding, Joe Francis Greenlaw, Will Haddock, Will Howard, Fred Kolflack, Lisa Struthers, Wolfram Von Masuski, and Loretta Williams for all their hard work. This takes a year of planning to put together a program like this. We appreciate it very much. I'd also like to, yes, thank you. I'd also like to thank our donors and sponsors. Without them, this would not be possible. And these include American International Exploration, Graphics Impression, Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Sterling Bank, the Summerlee Foundation, the Texas State Historical Association, and the University of Houston. So thank you for your contributions as well. I'd also like to recognize our exhibitors. We have a number here today: the Houston Museum of Natural Science, the River Oaks Bookstore, the San Jacinto chapter of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the San Jacinto Museum of History, Story Sloan Gallery, Sonnet Books, the Texas General Land Office, the Texas Navy Association, and the Texas State Historical Association. Also, I'd like to give special thanks to the San Jacinto Museum of History for sponsoring 10 scholarships for 4th and 7th grade teachers. I just want to say that the teachers perform a very important task. They introduce our children to Texas history, and we appreciate very much the roles you play in the lives of our children and bringing this important topic to them. And finally, I'd like to thank our 33 patrons. They're listed in your program. They're too numerous to mention, but they also provided a financial contribution to also help make this possible. Now, for those of you who did not take 4th and 7th grade Texas history, I want to give you just a very brief overview of what the Battle of San Jacinto was all about. This battle took place on April 20th and 21st, 1836, in what is now East Harris County, where Buffalo Bayou meets the San Jacinto River. It was the culminating event of about 6 weeks of retreating by the Texas Army under Sam Houston after the fall of the Alamo. It was during that time that the Mexican Army forces under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was pursuing Sam Houston eastward across Texas, and they finally met up at near Lynch's Ferry, where the battlefield is today, in East Harris County. And they spent a day firing against each other, but it was on April 21st in the afternoon that the Texas Army marched across the prairie, attacked the Mexican camp, and in less than 30 minutes had taken control of the camp. And for the next 2 hours, there was a lot of killing going on until dusk, when Colonel Juan Almonte surrendered, and the engagement came to be called the Battle of San Jacinto. When you compare this battle with the great battles of the Civil War, it's extremely small. It would be almost a blip on the scale of importance when you compare it against those kinds of battles. But for 1836, it was extremely important. It was considered a very decisive engagement. The results of the battle and the effect of the battle was that the Mexican Army retreated from Texas. It helped Texas establish its independence from Mexico, led to the Republic of Texas and eventual annexation of Texas to the United States. And so we call this period are the creation period of modern Texas, because this is the defining moment when you have this transition from Spanish and Mexican sovereignty in Texas to an Anglo-American sovereignty through the United States. So we have this symposium. We started this symposium in 2001 to try to provide an academic dimension to the commemoration of San Jacinto Day each April 21st. And we felt that it was important that during this time of the year that we bring together for a full day of discussion some of the best scholars we can find on a state, national, international level to bring new interpretations and research to disseminate these to the public. And we do this not just here live, but we also record these events and have them available on DVDs for posterity. We're creating a record. It's also important because it's part of our common heritage of who we are as Texans and what it means to be a Texan. And it's important for those of us who did go through the 4th and 7th grade and so forth to be reminded of this, but it's also important for newcomers who come to Texas to help them understand why Texas is unique. And this is really the defining moment. It gives Texas a very peculiar and unique history, very distinct from any other state, frankly. But it's also an important part of the history of the United States, this period of the Texas Revolution, as well as the history of Mexico. And that's what we're going to be discussing today on this 175th anniversary, the legacy of San Jacinto, and what it means and how we interpret this today and how this can be interpreted in the future, given all of our changing dynamics and the changing economic and societal conditions that we're facing in Texas, in the United States, and Mexico. So before we begin, I would like to make one other announcement. In the back is Amanda Danning, and she's working on a reconstruction of a skull of a Mexican soldier. Last year at this symposium, we featured an analysis of 6 Mexican soldier skulls that were discovered at the University of Pennsylvania and that had been picked up from the battlefield in 1837 by John James Audubon. Those skulls were sent to his friend, a scientist in Philadelphia, and lo and behold, we discovered that they're still there. So we had the Smithsonian Institution do an analysis of these skulls last year, and Amanda Danning, who lives in Columbus, is reconstructing them so we can see what these Mexican soldiers look like, and she'll be in the back today, so you can watch her do her work. We have had for many years as our moderator, Dr. James E. Crisp. He's Associate Professor of History at North Carolina State University. Jim is a native of Texas, born in Henrietta. He received his undergraduate degree from Rice and his doctoral degree from Yale, and he's been teaching at North Carolina State for many years. He is one of the leading experts on the Texas Revolution period and the Republic period. He's the author of Sleuthing the Alamo and also How Did Davy Die and Why Do We Care So Much? It is a great privilege and pleasure to welcome Jim back, and he's going to give us a brief introduction of our program today and our speakers. And one other thing before I go, I do want to mention one thing about our organization, the Friends of San Jacinto Battleground. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have 2 primary missions. One is to help educate the public about the Battle of San Jacinto, which we do through this symposium and other events. And the other important mission we have is preservation of the battlefield, which we view as extremely important. The battlefield has many threats today, and we're trying to protect the battlefield and reclaim it as best as we can. And we're trying to finish the job that the veterans of the battle themselves started, which is to create a sense of place so that Texans for all future generations can come there and help understand and appreciate and learn about what happened on April 21st, 1836. So that's our organization, and again, we very much appreciate you coming out and participating today. With that, I'll have Jim Crisp speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. As most of you know, Jeff twisted my arm to become a speaker at the first annual San Jacinto Symposium before we knew it was going to be an annual symposium. And then, as someone mentioned last night, I was merely a heckler at the second annual San Jacinto Symposium. And so, starting with the third, they made me moderator for life so that I can't be a heckler anymore. And when that was mentioned, someone said I ought to have a permanent name tag, so you'll see I'm wearing both my new permanent name tag and my temporary name tag for just this weekend. And I think if you're going to get your money's worth out of this, you ought to have me back for at least one more year. A few years ago, Barbara Eves, whom most of you know and who is a loyal volunteer among all these other volunteers that put this symposium together, asked me to do an article for a special San Jacinto issue of Houston History Magazine, which is published here at the University of Houston by the Department of History. She asked me to write an essay on the legacy of San Jacinto. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because there isn't a single legacy of San Jacinto. So I ended up instead writing an article about the contested legacies of San Jacinto, because we know what happened pretty much on that battlefield, but what that battle means, what it meant at the time and what it continues to mean today, and how its meaning, how its meaning actually changes over time, and how it means different things to different people, is what I tried to address in a very brief way in that essay, and what our very distinguished speakers today, this morning and this afternoon, will be talking about. I'm going to give rather full introductions to each of the speakers just before they speak, but suffice it to say for the moment that these two very distinguished historians who are on the dais now, Daniel Walker Howe and Romeo Ricardo Flores Caballero, representing their respective countries of the United States and Mexico, both of whom Texas has diplomatic relations with. I was instructed by Governor Perry to say that. These two very distinguished historians will be talking about the impact of the battle and of the independence of the Texas Republic on their two nations that share, along with that northern place, this North American continent. The Texas Revolution is so very interesting because things are happening on several scales at once. The very human scale of this small battle, and a battle like the Alamo, where only about 200 men on one side fight in a small affair, as General Santa Anna said, but a small affair that keeps echoing and resonating down through the centuries. So on one level, it's a very human and small scale, and yet there are continental consequences for what's going on in Texas in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. There are British agents, there are American agents. You know about the great game between Russia and Britain in Afghanistan. Well, there's a great game going on in Texas too, as the contest for the continent of North America between these contending forces is taking place. Let me just briefly mention that there are door prizes today. The Texas State Historical Association has donated a copy of the Texas Almanac, and one of the hidden treasures of University of Houston, the Arte Publico Press, which is located just a few blocks from here, has donated a copy of their new book edited by one of our former speakers, Raul Ramos, and his colleague Monica Perales. The title is Recovering the Hispanic History of Texas. I have one of the chapters in this. These door prizes will be determined by a secret method devised by David Britton, and he's working on figuring out how he's going to do it right now. But the winners of those door prizes will be announced this afternoon. Now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you first Professor Daniel Walker Howe. As you have read in your program, he won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2008 for his absolutely remarkable book, What Hath God Wrought? The Transformation of America, 1815 to 1848, which of course includes this time of the creation of modern Texas, as Jeff Dunn called it a moment ago, with very interesting chapters that cover the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico. But to say that is a paltry way of describing the book. It is really a tour de force of combining social, intellectual, religious, economic histories in way, and seeing connections between them in ways that just sparkle with new insights in every chapter. Dan Howe is Professor Emeritus at both Oxford University in England and the University of California at Los Angeles. He has written many other works on the intellectual and cultural life of early 19th century America. He will amaze you with some things about the United States that you thought you understood but really didn't understand in full context. And so rather than me talking about Dan's work, why don't you hear from Dan himself?
In 1819, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams signed a treaty with Luis Leonis, who was representing the King of Spain, that defined the boundary between the United States and the Spanish dominions. Spain ceded the Floridas, East and West Florida, to the United States, but more significant for our purposes, the negotiators also defined a transcontinental boundary running from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. When the negotiations began, Secretary Adams had hoped to acquire some or all of Texas in this boundary definition, but eventually he agreed to leave Texas to Spain in return for Spain ceding the Oregon Country, its claim to the Oregon Country, to the United States. And for the time being, Secretary Adams believed that it was more important for the United States to get a window on the Pacific. Well, Spain waited 2 years to ratify the treaty, but finally did so in February of 1821. And just a few months after that, in August of the same year, Mexico achieved its independence from Spain. This, of course, changed the situation on the ground drastically, and the question then arose whether the new sovereign, Mexico, would respect the same boundary that the old sovereign Spain had agreed to. This, of course, is Andrew Jackson. When Jackson became president in 1829, he resumed the efforts that John Quincy Adams had initiated to redefine the boundary between the United States and Mexico and thereby acquire Texas. But once again, Mexico was not interested in yielding Texas. However, in 1832, while Jackson was president, Mexico finally did agree that the boundary negotiated back in 1819 could be the boundary between the United States and Mexico. Well, this, of course, is Sam Houston, the victor at San Jacinto and subsequently president of the Texan Republic. When the Texan Revolution broke out, the Mexicans blamed Andrew Jackson for having fomented it. But in fact, he doesn't seem to have done so. Indeed, Jackson rather worried that the Texan Revolution might complicate his efforts to acquire Texas for the United States. Jackson declared official neutrality in the fighting that ensued between Mexicans and Texans. However, in practice, he did nothing to prevent a massive shipment of arms and men from the United States to Texas. Once the Battle of San Jacinto had secured Texan independence, Houston and his successors as presidents of Mexico had their choice of two kinds of policies that they could follow. One would be to seek annexation by the United States, but the other possibility was to pursue the long-term interests of an independent Texas. And these, assuming that Texas might be independent for quite a while. And one of these long-term interests might involve westward expansion all the way to the Pacific, make Texas a two-ocean power. Of course, the United States wouldn't be interested in furthering that kind of objective, but Texan policymakers figured maybe they could get financial aid from Britain to pursue that kind of policy. Well, that second policy option, of course, horrified U.S. Policymakers in Washington, because an independent Texas, powerful, allied with the British Empire, well, that would be a disaster for U.S. domination of the North American continent. Martin Van Buren, in 1836, Andrew Jackson's vice president, was elected president to succeed him. The Texan Revolution had not originated in defense of slavery, but the successful Texan Revolution did have the effect of confirming the existence of slavery in Texas. And the existence of slavery in Texas made the acquisition of Texas controversial in the United States, because most Northerners did not want any more slave states in the Union. This is William Henry Harrison, elected President of the United States in 1840. He defeated Martin Van Buren. The country was suffering economic hard times, and as everybody knows, then as now, hard times will mean that whichever party is in office will lose and the other party will come to power. If President Harrison here had lived out his term, Texas would probably have remained an independent nation longer. Harrison had been elected by the Whig Party, that's W-H-I-G. The Whig Party was much less interested in westward expansion than the Jacksonian Democrats were. Instead, the Whig Party was interested in American economic development and industrialization. That's the kind of thing the Whigs wanted to promote. Well, President Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address of any president. He delivered it on a cold day without wearing an overcoat. He caught a cold. The cold turned to pneumonia. And soon after President Harrison had named his cabinet secretaries, he died. Of course, the vice president succeeded him. The vice president was John Tyler of Virginia. To the horror of the Whigs, Tyler turned out to be a Democrat in Whig clothing. Like most Democrats of the time, he strongly believed in America's manifest destiny, that is, plain, obvious destiny, to expand westward. So President Tyler vetoed the Whig program that was enacted by the Whig Congress and instead pursued the acquisition of Texas. Daniel Webster, one of the famous Whig politicians of this period, had been appointed Secretary of State by President Harrison. He remained Secretary of State for some time, even under Tyler, because he was busy negotiating a treaty with Great Britain to define the boundaries of Maine and Minnesota with Canada. But once that treaty was over, Webster and his president, Tyler, came to the parting of the ways. Webster did not want to pursue the annexation of Texas. And of course, you can't have a president and a secretary of state pursuing different foreign policies. Webster had to resign. All the other Whig cabinet secretaries resigned too. And the Congressional Whig Party expelled President Tyler from the Whig Party, the only time in history when a president has been expelled from his own party. This is a statue of John C. Calhoun, made by the sculptor Hiram Powers. He shows Calhoun as a Roman legislator holding up a scroll. In those days, of course, classics, Latin, was the mainstay of higher education. And people, especially politicians and statesmen, were very flattered to be portrayed in a Roman toga as Roman heroes. So here's John C. Calhoun. President Tyler wanted a Secretary of State who would not be deterred from annexing Texas by the slavery issue. He first turned to a Virginian named Abel Upshur, but Secretary Upshur was suddenly killed when a naval gun that was a newly manufactured naval gun that was being demonstrated exploded. So Tyler then turned to John C. Calhoun, the famous pro-slavery South Carolinian. Calhoun negotiated a treaty between the United States and the Republic of Texas, providing that the United States would annex the Republic of Texas. But we all know that treaties have to be ratified, confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. Well, the treaty annexing Texas couldn't get that kind of confirmation from the Senate, and so it did not take effect, and the question of Texas annexation was still left open for the election of 1844. Well, the election campaign of 1844 was waged primarily on the issue of westward expansion. The Democrats ran James Knox Polk, a great admirer of Andrew Jackson, nicknamed Young Hickory, as Jackson had been Old Hickory. Polk ran on a platform of acquiring not only Texas, but Oregon too. Henry Clay, who's pictured here, was the Whig candidate. The Whigs, as I've said, were less interested in expanding America than they were in enhancing the quality of American life with industrialization, education, and social reform. Clay warned against the hasty annexation of Texas. He predicted that it would provoke war with Mexico. Clay wanted peace with Mexico. In fact, he wanted peace with all the Latin American countries because Clay envisioned the United States as industrializing. He wanted to export manufactured goods to the Latin American countries, and therefore peace and good relations with Latin America were key for Clay's statecraft. Clay was also disturbed by the prospect that the annexation of Texas would provoke conflict between the North and the South. Clay wanted at all costs to avoid conflict between the North and the South. His nickname was the Great Compromiser. He had arranged compromises in the past between North and South, and he would do so in the future. Well, the election of 1844 was one of the most momentous in American history. But the year 1844 was momentous for another reason, too. Besides the election, this man, Samuel Finley Morse, made 1844 important in another way. In May of that year, Professor Morse, seated in the chambers of the United States Supreme Court in Washington, tapped out a message on a funny-looking device of cogs and coiled wires. He used a code that he had recently devised, and he spelled out the words, "What hath God wrought?" A quotation from the Bible. The words proved the perfect choice for a historic event. 40 miles away in Baltimore, Morse's associate received the electric signals and telegraphed the message back. As those who witnessed it well understood, this demonstration would change the world. That's the device that was in Baltimore that received Morse's message. It's now in the Museum of the College of Engineering at Cornell University. This is the Morse Code. It was memorized for many years by telegraphers and others. I believe ham radio operators used Morse code until just a few years ago. The invention of electric telegraphy helped turn the dream of America's manifest destiny into a practical aspiration, made it all the more manifest, if you like, because it meant that it would be possible to have a continental-sized nation that could still be in touch with each other. Back to politics. James Knox Polk, shown here, narrowly won the election of 1844. A minor party took a few votes away from Clay in New York State, meant that Polk carried New York, and that decided the election. President Tyler, of course, is president at the time of the election. He had hoped the Democrats would nominate him. He was disappointed when they didn't, and he felt a certain understandable resentment that Polk here had stolen his issue, the annexation of Texas, and had won with it. Tyler wanted his place in history. So another way was figured out to annex Texas. The Constitution provides, quote, "New states may be admitted by the Congress into this union," unquote. Well, such an act of Congress admitting Texas as a state would only require a simple majority in the House and a simple majority in the Senate. That was a lot easier to get than 2/3 of the senators, so that's the way it was done. And John Tyler, on his last day in office, signed the act of Congress admitting Texas as a state. But the new President Polk here had even grander ambitions. He wanted California as well as Texas. Well, this map here shows Texas when it had been part of Mexico. Texas then was part of a state called Coahuila y Tejas, that state within Mexico. The Tejas part of that state had been northeast of the Nueces River. The map also shows us that the various Mexican states in pink here were all in rebellion against the central government once Santana violated the Mexican Constitution and set himself up as a dictator. So there were rebellions all over Mexico, and only the rebellion by Texas succeeded. The others were all suppressed by Santana. Well, when the Texans captured Santana following the Battle of San Jacinto, they made him sign an agreement to evacuate the Mexican army beyond the Rio Grande. The Texans interpreted this agreement as establishing the Rio Grande from its source to its mouth as the western boundary of their republic. And you see it indicated by the dotted red line on the map. Well, the American President Polk wanted California. And when Mexico wouldn't sell it, going to war with Mexico offered a way to get California. Polk sent an army into the disputed area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. It was a very provocative action, and it has looked to many observers at the time, and to me too in retrospect, that Polk was using the dispute over the boundary of Texas as a way to get a war that would get California. War between the United States and Mexico did ensue. Because of the innovations in technology, the American public was able to follow the events of the war. This is a picture showing the Battle of Monterrey, Monterrey in Mexico, not Monterey in California. It's been reproduced by lithography, which was another technique of mass production that was reinforcing telegraphy as a way to spread information rapidly. And here you can see how the American public was so very enthusiastic about getting news from the battlefront in Mexico. This hotel doubles as a post office, and so the newspaper has just arrived at the post office. The man is reading it aloud to all the other men. The news from the front would be sent by steamship across the Gulf of Mexico to New Orleans. And then in New Orleans, at first, the New Orleans Picayune would scoop all the other papers in the country, but the other papers were eager to get their share of news, and a telegraph line was hastily built to New Orleans so that the news of the war could be spread that way. Couple of things I'll point out to you. The black people who are trying to hear too, but they're on the margin. Historians sometimes talk about certain social groups being marginalized. The artist has literally marginalized them in this painting, but there's a person who's even more marginalized, and that's the only woman in the picture. And she is sticking her head out the window on the far edge of the picture. She's definitely marginalized. Climactic moment of the war between the United States and Mexico. The American Army, led by General Winfield Scott, enters Mexico City. How many people have been to Mexico City? Great. Looked like most of us. Well, if you've been there, you know this scene because it looks pretty much the same way today. This is the Zócalo, the central plaza, historic plaza of Mexico City. That's the 16th century Spanish cathedral, and across on the other side of the plaza, the Palacio Nacional, where the presidents of Mexico lived, and before them, the viceroys of New Spain lived there, and before that, the Aztec emperors had their palace on the very same site. So, the municipal government of Mexico City has surrendered the city to the invading army, but the populace, in fact, continued to resist by whatever means were at their disposal. And the artist shows a man in the lower foreground who is reaching down to pick up a stone to throw it at the invaders. But a U.S. soldier on a white horse, looking over his shoulder, sees the man and will probably prevent that. The war against Mexico was by no means uncontroversial. It was not one of the wars that have been supported by a general consensus of the American public, because the Whig Party continued to oppose the war. and one of the leading and most vociferous critics of the war is shown here, and I trust you can all recognize the young Abraham Lincoln, who at this time is a congressman, a Whig congressman from Illinois, made two speeches in the House of Representatives denouncing Polk for waging aggressive war and general duplicity. So the war came to a conclusion, successful from the point of view of the United States and President Polk in particular, and Polk got his California. This you see what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo provided. The U.S. negotiator, Nicholas Trist, actually took less land from Mexico than President Polk had wanted. And he signed the treaty in violation of his orders from Washington. For his disobedience, Polk had Trist arrested and sent back to the United States in custody. But the president realized there was no practical alternative to submitting Trist's treaty for Senate approval, so he did. Unknown to the negotiators in Guadalupe Hidalgo, gold had been discovered in California 9 days before the treaty had been signed. California had more value than even James Knox Polk could have realized. And here we see an early scene of the California gold rush. This picture was drawn not by a professional artist, but by somebody who just happened to be there and could draw a little. So he drew this picture of California. It's still 1848. It's a few months after gold was discovered in February. And you can see here that there are people from many parts of the world and all walks of life, and they are busy panning for gold. The news of the discovery of gold in California spread, of course, all over the world. It spread first, actually, around the Pacific Rim because information traveled faster across water than across land, unless you had a telegraph line, and there wasn't a telegraph line to California. Actually, there wasn't one until 1861. But when the news did reach the eastern part of the country, the telegraph helped distribute it. And once again, we're in another post office, which is the place where people picked up their newspapers in those days. Once again, here's a man reading the newspaper out loud. Look how excited that young woman is to hear about the prospects of gold in California. Once again, by the way, we have a black person who wants to hear. Once again, the artist shows that person on the margin. Now, in the front of the picture, we have a man with a beard. He's selling tickets on a ship to California. The ship is the Lu Chu. There's a poster about it hanging on the wall. The name tells us that the ship had been engaged in the China trade, but it's now been diverted to carrying passengers to California, like so many other ships. And of course, they had to sail all the way around Cape Horn. A few people sailed to Panama and then went over the Panamanian mountains, but then it was usually hard to get a ship the rest of the way because they didn't sail regularly and you were risking getting malaria. Going around Cape Horn took months and months, but even so, it was faster than walking across the plains and mountains alongside your ox-pulled covered wagon. Well, this is Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, and part of the area that the United States acquired from Mexico was Utah. So the Mormon settlement there in Utah became part of the United States. The Mormons fled from persecution in Missouri and Illinois, and they had intended to escape from the United States when they went to Utah, but they ended up back in the United States again. One of the seemingly unlikely remote consequences of the Texan Revolution. Well, here's a general representation of the Westward Movement as Americans at least like to think of it. You see in the corner there men who are clearing forest to create farmland. You see the children going to school. You see some pioneers heading out with covered wagons to cross the plains, but there's also a railroad heading west. And if you look closely, you can see that alongside the railroad track are the telegraph poles and the telegraph wires. Over on another side, you see the American Indians watching their country being transformed in this way, watching it all probably with considerable misgivings. Well, thank you very much for your attention. And I'll be happy to take questions if there are any. Is that part of the schedule?
Yes. Let me explain. Can you hear me? Yes. Let me explain just briefly how we're going to handle the questions. In the remaining time for Dr. Howe, before we take a break at 10:30, he will be happy to entertain questions from the floor, and as will all of our speakers immediately after their talk. But we also have a time for general questions and answers in the afternoon. And if you have a question that you'd like to be addressed to any of the speakers in the afternoon, please put those in writing and give us to them during our last break. Give them directly to me during the last break, and I will censor them. Well, oh well, the truth is out. I will edit them.
Okay, but if somebody wants to ask an uncensored question now,
uncensored
they
questions
can.
may be asked now. So we'll have both direct questions from the floor, and I believe we have a microphone in the center aisle. If you would come up and ask your question from the microphone, please.
Yeah, Professor Howe, first of all, thank you for a very compelling presentation. Comment and then a question. The comment is, in 1847, a 16-year-old young student at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in South Hadley, Massachusetts, wrote to her brother, Austin Dickinson, "Dear Austin, do you think the Mexicans will take South Hadley? And that's not the entire letter, but of course her father was a Whig. Her father, Edward, served in the Massachusetts state legislature and shared, I think, the future President Abraham Lincoln's reservation about the Mexican War. Do you think the Mexicans will come to South Hadley? The second is a question. You've noted on several occasions in talking about the artwork, the marginalization of African Americans. I'm curious about the artist specifically and what you think the intent was. Was it to make a statement, or was it a reflection of the artist's political views?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think in each case, the artist wanted to show the black people sympathetically, and to the extent that sympathy for black people was a political statement at the time, it was a political statement. But the artist also, but the artist showed that in fact the black people were marginalized. So I think he's trying to show the reality of the situation, but he also wants to show them sympathetically.
Dr. Howe, I understand that both Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant served in the American Army in the Mexican War, but I also understand, and I don't know how early this was in their experience, that they both felt that maybe the United States really shouldn't be in that war. First of all, I may be wrong in my understanding. Could you elaborate that issue a little bit?
Okay. A lot of the men who were generals in the Civil War were young junior officers in the war against Mexico. And in some cases, men who would later lead opposing armies fought side by side in the Mexican War. Okay, and dealing with your specific question, I actually don't know about Lee, but I do know about Grant. Because Grant later in his memoirs, which he wrote, made it very clear that he thought that the Mexican War was a war of aggression and immoral and so on. But of course, Grant was a graduate of West Point, like Lee, and didn't feel like he had a choice as to whether or not to serve. But actually, quite a few of the men who fought in the Mexican War disapproved of it politically. I think it would be fair to say that most of the officers in the career army were Whigs. On the other hand, most of the men who volunteered to serve in the American Army were Democrats, because, of course, if you were volunteering to serve in the war, then you probably agreed with it, and that meant that you were a Democrat, because these issues were so intensely partisan at the time.
If there's no one at the microphone now, let me ask a question, if I may take the moderator's privilege. I know, Dr. Howe, that you're going to be taken to the San Jacinto battleground on Sunday, and you'll see, yes. By the way, this is Dr. Howe's first time in Houston, so we want to all give him a special welcome. And when he sees that battleground monument, he will see what the French consul did not notice when he gave a speech once there, because the speech he gave was carved on the stone behind him. Apparently one of his aides had written it for him and taken it word for word from the monument. And so you could, it was sort of like reading along. But what this engraving on the monument says is that the consequences of the Battle of San Jacinto were, as I perhaps suggested earlier today, continental, and that all of that area that you've shown coming from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo followed almost as night follows day. We know that the Texas Revolution was a very close-run thing, as they say. Santa Anna grabbing defeat from the jaws of victory. And you've talked about contingency in your work, the non-inevitability of events in American history, but you've also talked about the dynamism, the tremendous dynamism of this technologically advancing country in the period that you've covered until 1848. So had things gone the other way in April, 175 years ago, do you see the United States as nevertheless advancing to California and that full Pacific coast?
Wow, what a question. Well, if Santana had succeeded in putting down the rebellion in Texas the way he succeeded in putting down the rebellion in the other Mexican states, which is what is implied if the battle had gone the other way or something, then I think, well, the United States would have reached the Pacific anyway, because I think the United States would still have gotten at least the southern part of Oregon when we partitioned Oregon with Britain, we got what's now Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. They got what is now British Columbia. We would still have reached the Pacific, and then I guess gold would have been discovered. There would have been a mad scramble of people going to California, as there was. Mexican authority in California was very tenuous. It's hard for me to believe that the Mexicans could have maintained their authority in California with people coming from all over the world and more from the United States than anywhere else. So I wouldn't be surprised if there hadn't been a little revolution in California, the way that in fact there was a little revolution in California, and maybe a short-lived California independence, the way there sort of was. So I think California might have gone to the United States. It's harder to figure out what would have happened in Texas if the Texans had lost at San Jacinto. San Jacinto was really an awfully important battle.
We're very happy that you said that. We have time for one more question from the microphone, please.
I have a daughter that married this young man from New Mexico, and they live in Mesilla, which is a suburb.
You have to speak up, please.
Okay.
That's better.
I have a daughter that married this gentleman from, or a doctor from New Mexico, and they live in Mesilla, New Mexico, which is something like Bel Air is to Houston. And he is quite a history buff, and sometimes he embarrasses me because he knows more about Texas history than I do, and he knows more politics about Texas than I do. And he mentioned that there was a Mesilla Treaty. Now, is that the same treaty as the Guadalupe Hidalgo, or is that I think a Gladstone Treaty that was
It's probably, he's probably referring to a local treaty that applied to New Mexico. There was also a local treaty in California, but
This is the Treaty of Mesilla, as I learned from Professor Flores yesterday, is how the Gadsden Purchase Treaty
oh, that
is
treaty.
referred
Okay,
to in
okay.
Mexico. The Mesilla Valley
Okay.
is a part of that, as well as Tucson. Essentially, Tucson, Tubac, northern Sonora, or what is now southern Arizona, was purchased by the United States in 1853. from a government-
Purchased, by the way, from Santana, who
Exactly.
had gotten back into power, amazingly enough, in Mexico, and who, being his usual corrupt self, sold an additional area of Mexico for, what was it? How much? 10 million? 15 million? 5 million? For only $5 million.
The bidding is going down as we're seeing.
Yeah.
here.
So he was immediately overthrown because the Mexican public was so outraged that, you know, he was selling off their patrimony. But yeah,
Okay. Thank you both.
okay.
Probably a little-known fact to some of you, but one of the more prominent families in Tucson at the time of the Gadsden Purchase or the Treaty of Mesilla were a German-Mexican family by the name of Ronstadt. And so this is where Linda Ronstadt comes from. And Paul Simon in his Graceland album mentions that she's a daughter of Tucson, Arizona. And that family goes back a very long time into Tucson's history.
Okay, thank you.